Let us start with basic questions about Ottoman science and scientists. But we rather, or this talk series rather, is interested in humans and human stories. That's
Right.
why I want to start with the question of who was or who were the scientists? I mean, was there any separate identity, for example, in the Ottoman Empire? Or it was like a separate class of people who were called as scientists, or did they call themselves as scientists? Who are they? Let's just start with their story and definition of it.
Right. So that's a very good question. I mean, generally speaking, so there is this concept of alim, he who knows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And scientists, at least in the earlier part of the empire, 15th, 16th centuries,
Mm-hmm.
they would be a type of alim. And just like many other alims or ulema,
Mm-hmm.
if you prefer, they would do a bunch of things at the same time. So just because you're interested in medicine doesn't mean you're not interested in theology, or you're not
Right.
interested in astronomy or philosophy or Arabic grammar, right? So they
Right.
probably did all of these things together. So that's one sort of the intellectual breadth of these people. Two, occupationally, you probably had a salary job teaching at a medrese, and probably at some point in your career, if you were really good at what you were doing, you ended up in palace service, which was less work, more money, and then that's kind of like your employment prospects. So you would start going to school, to a medrese, at a fairly young age, definitely younger than 18, right? So you would be younger than a college student today. But then there was no primary, secondary, tertiary education, like a formal path that would take you to the medrese. So people came in through all kinds of paths. And at the medrese, you would get something like a college education. Somebody would lecture you. You would have homework. You would read stuff, and listen to your professor. And you would spend a good many years at the medrese. So it wasn't like an in and out affair. And you would be, just again, just to set the scene for what I'm going to say later. I mean, your understanding of natural science would be pretty much in line with what the Greeks thought, ancient Greeks, people like Aristotle and Galen and Ptolemy, or, Galen isn't Greek, but let's say Hippocrates, what they thought science was. So, there was a kind of like a Greek culture of science in this earlier period. And then things change. I mean, my understanding is that, most people think it has maybe something to do with religion. I'm trying to push back against that idea. I don't think religion was the main reason why this order went out of pretty much went out of existence over the from the late 16th century maybe to the 18th century. My understanding is that this at some point medreses really stopped paying their professors well, and their numbers multiplied, and employment got more difficult. The terms of employment got more difficult, and once that persisted for like a couple of generations, people just the kinds of people that you want as professors were no longer attracted to the teaching profession. They went on to do other things. Right. So that gives me phase two, or the second type of person that you wouldn't find in the 15th and the 16th centuries, but you would find in the 17th and 18th centuries. So unlike the 15th, 16th century type, 17th, 18th century natural scientist does not really do Greek categories, right? So they aren't interested in theoretical astronomy or the philosophy of nature. They're interested in engineering and curing patients, and drawing up calendars and collecting taxes and that kind of practical occupation, casting cannons, mixing gunpowder, building ships, that sort of thing. Very technical, very utilitarian things. these people may or may not have a formal education. They may or may not, again, this is quite different from the 15th and the 16th centuries. They may actually be shopkeepers or a private, they just might be doing any or all of these things privately for pay as a service, or they could be selling products. They could, some of them, who are formally employed, you usually find them either in the financial bureaucracy of the empire, or you can find them at, working as like interpreters, because, they also tend to know a fair number of languages. So they could be working at, they could be interpreters to the Ottoman Sultan, or the Imperial Council, as they're officially called, or they could be interpreters to, one of the consuls, like, the British consul, the Italian consul, or well, the Italian bailo, or the French consul.
Right.
So that's the second stage. And then you have a third stage, right? That's usually associated with the 19th century, 18th, 19th centuries. And the important thing is, again, like, one way people think about this is like, oh, they had Islamic things and then they had Western things. But no, actually, this middle phase is quite important, because what happens is, of course, Ottomans don't go from like madrasas where they are teaching Islamic stuff to universities where they are teaching Western stuff. What happens is madrasas, they first, just, go through this financially difficult time. Science turns into something practical. And then Ottomans don't open universities. They open little academies at first for engineers and physicians. So that becomes kind of like the path they take, right? So they run with this practical aspect of science. Only at the very end of the empire, I would say maybe like mid 19th century, you could even stretch it like, to make it later, that they take on these like university type institutions, and they create this, this one very unique institution called Darülfünun, where they are actually teaching. They go back to teaching pure science rather than all of these like, practical things. So they start teaching theoretical astronomy and theoretical physics to students in this institution. And so, that would be the third phase, where you can actually speak of like, Westernization, because you have something that's like similar to the university, and that's not necessarily inspired by the past of the Ottoman Empire. So that comes in as a rupture. But by that point, I would say, the Ottomans have already crossed the threshold into modernity. So this kind of like practical orientation is something that we're very familiar with today, because this is something that we think about all the time, in higher education. What can I do with this degree, and things like that, right? So, if you just put in those concerns, just move it back a few centuries back, it makes total sense, the way they did this. But that also has a cost. Again, like, liberal arts, all of these like useless disciplines, like my own, like history of science. Nobody will die without it, but
history is even worse. I mean, history of science is something,
right.
but our field is even, condemned.
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, you, by the way, you just remind us again that, we are talking about an empire which lasted close to 600 years. And when we talk about Ottoman science, obviously we cannot reduce any of those histories into one particular moment or century. It is great that you are telling us this little like evolution of Ottoman notion of science and scientists, which was great. And you also telling us that, especially pre-modern scientists, so to speak, were more of a polymath along the line with the Greeks and then Islamic scientists and whatnot, who did deal with, or who did have an interest into so many fields, including but not limited to science. That's great. You also talk about a lot, you make reference a lot to the difference between practice and theory. I want to come to that point. This is a very important issue, actually, that I would like to discuss with you in a moment. But before that, since we are now covering the basics, history of Ottoman science basics, can you also tell us, what were the main occupations of Ottoman scientists or science? I mean, in what fields, in other words, they kind of excelled? In what field or to what field they developed more interests?
I mean, they are so okay. Let me put it to you this way. So they are interested in astronomy for a while. But by astronomy, don't think astronomy like astronomy today. Like don't think like Neil deGrasse Tyson. But think of it like astronomy as a living, useful discipline. Because so today we no longer think much about astronomy because we have removed a lot of the functions of astronomy and relocated it to different things. So nobody needs to like look at the sky to tell what day of the month it is anymore. Right. Unless you're like living in the wilderness, and it's actually a nice skill to have if you have it. But you see, like a lot of things that astronomy does, we no longer do. So we no longer have to like look at the stars to again to see what direction we need to drive, or just lots of these things, or we don't need to look at the sky to talk about the weather, right? This is another thing, because I mean, if you buy a farmer's almanac today, I think those documents still use quite old and established notions in practical astronomy to tell you when you're going to have a storm and when it's going to be cold and when the spring will arrive and when you should plant your cucumbers or whatever. So all of those things fall under astronomy. I would say astronomy can be quite a useful discipline, but it's also a very tough discipline to master because it requires a very high level of numeracy. So you need to be like really good at math in order to do astronomy. So it requires training. It requires some talents. And this is one of the things that people are interested in. I would say, again, like, in more in the earlier period than in the later period. Another classic, accompaniment of astronomy is, of course, astrology. Again, don't think of astrology as like, oh, I looked at my horoscope and I'm going to meet the love of my life tomorrow or something like that. No, actually, people, again, look to the stars to determine, sometimes, to find answers to questions that we don't have answers to today. So, some of the things that they do is like, okay, we need to fight this war. When should we start fighting it? So today, if you had that question, of course, you want to be prepared and so on and so forth. But that by itself won't tell you like exactly when you should like go to war or something. So when people have those questions, well, they turn to the stars. I mean, do the stars have something to contribute? So it's not like, they just look at their horoscope and pick up and go. It's like, they do everything else, but they also need this like additional sort of idea, support, something like that. And they find that in the stars. Also, just like, we use a lot of predictive technologies today, which are, of course, no better or worse than astrology in many ways. So things like, financial forecasting, etc. So, Ottomans were no less interested in their futures than we were, and astrology really comes in as a kind of like a
handy thing.
Yeah, handy thing. All right, so they look at astrology as this kind of like very, very large domain of practices where you can ask questions and like get a forecast for like events. Well, is this marriage going to work out and things like that? So you can like ask questions. You can also get like just period specific forecasts if you wish. So that's one of the large domains, and they would call it ilmi nujum, or like science of the stars, which is exactly the same name Latins would use or the Europeans would use for astronomy / astrology. So that's one thing. Medicine is another thing. So Ottomans do a lot of medicine. I mean, there are many, of course, institutions of medicine, but another thing to keep in mind is that Istanbul is a very big city. you could make the case that, you know, by the end of the 16th century, it is the largest city in the world, even larger than Beijing, which, you know, is usually the main contender for that position. So that means, you know, well, you know, you have a lot of people, which also means you have a lot of people who get sick and need a doctor.
Right.
And then there's the plague, right? Because this is the period for the plague. So if you have a very crowded, very big city of like, you know, Istanbul is like 500,000, even more maybe. And the plague is like, you know, coming and hitting you every other year, like we are being hit by COVID. And suddenly, you know, you have this like huge city that has a huge demand for medicine. So that's another field that the Ottomans have paid considerable, you know, time, attention, and money to. You know, being a physician, being a private physician is a very good job in Istanbul, just as it is today. So that's another thing that they do. There are institutions, as I said, you know, there are like medical schools. And there are, you know, hospitals which offer training and, you know, patient care, much like, you know, hospitals today. But again, like, you know, think of like, you know, today, but move it back a few centuries, so you don't get the impression that, you know, there is like an ICU or something, right? But they are like, you know, places where people are treated in quantity by professionally trained physicians. So, you know, I would say, you know, that's another thing that they are quite good at. Engineering, architecture, those types of things, you know, they are quite good at. Again, in the earlier period, you have people, you know, who think about these things more theoretically, people who write about these things. And from the later periods, most of what we have are just like, you know, things that seem to be still standing, like, you know, waterways and you know, palaces and kiosks and so on and so forth, and other things like, you know, bridges, etc. That, you know, that seem to have been quite well built at their time. So
military probably, right, at the early stages of Ottoman Empire could be
yes, military
an area
is
of technique
quite
and technology.
important, because I mean there are some things in military that require precision. I mean, so some things like, you know, I teach this. I teach especially like warfare in the 17th century, and you know, one thing that most people talk about is like, you know, when you're like in, you know, when you're shooting cannons, like you need to like calculate projectiles, etc., etc. Whereas, you know, if you look at the histories, it looks like everybody kind of shot their cannons point blank, so no projectile knowledge necessary to, you know, shoot your target, especially like at sea. So, you know, that's kind of like, you know, one thing to keep in mind. So some things actually require precision. Other things, you know, we think they require precision, but in practice they don't. One thing that definitely requires precision is you know, preparing these things. So casting cannons. So the manufacture side, I would say, preparing gunpowder. Like these things require like, you know, precise timing, good mixture of like, you know, chemicals, etc., etc. So they are also good at these things. And they even like standardize those things a little bit. So I would say maybe these are like, you know, the main ticket items, in addition to like, you know, other more I don't know, like less mainstream things that they also seem to be doing.
But in that sense, I mean, do you think that Ottoman history was any different than other big empires in the time? Like, you know, was it part of this global story, including Europe, by the way?
Right.
Or do
I
you
would
see
say,
any unique trajectory in the Ottoman scientific thinking and practice?
that's a very good question. I think, you know, the Ottoman story is a very global story, as in, you know, the things that you find in the Ottoman Empire, you're very likely to find elsewhere. So you will find it in China, you'll find it in Spain, you'll find it in England. So these types of figures, these types of concerns are, I won't call it universal, but they are global. So they are not culturally specific. And I would say a lot of the genres of science that you find in the Ottoman Empire are actually genres of science that you find elsewhere.
So I would say yes, definitely. This is a very global story, and it's a very relatable story, and it's a story. If you took this as a template, you would find in most other places. This is quite different from the European story that we are usually told, where you have like a cast of characters, right? You have a canon, like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton. Descartes.
I was going to come to that question actually. Maybe to be more specific, I should ask, or I could ask you to continue your story. I mean, if there was such a divergence, if there was any, I mean, when that divergence, separation of European story started in this global history? You think?
That's a very good question. So I would say probably at the end of the 16th century. That's when the divergence begins in a way. I mean, there are some like small differences, quite insignificant differences. Again, when you look at like the globe at large, between how people do things in the Ottoman Empire and how people do things in various parts of Europe. I mean, so the divergence, I would say, probably comes at the end of the 16th century, which again is the argument that I'm putting forward in my book. And it comes with this bout of hyperinflation, and then it lingers on, and then it just changes the whole nature of the scientific enterprise in the empire. But I would say the divergence is, first of all, it's not that big, because the people.
At first.
No, actually, I would say for several centuries, maybe all the way until the 19th century, the divergence isn't that much. Well, for a number of reasons. For one, I mean, so the Ottoman Empire doesn't have it doesn't have very many, let me put it that way, standout figures who are like, whoa, like, change science for everybody for, at all times or something like that, right? You don't have figures like this. But that doesn't mean that, Ottoman, again, ships don't float or like, people die because they can't find physicians, etc. No, what's rather the case is that, you have some very exceptional figures in Europe, usually quite a bit apart. So, I mean, if you wanted to count like all the active physicists in Newton's time, you would basically get a handful of people in the entire continent. Right, so it's not like there are just so many scientists in Europe, and Newton happens to be like the best among them. It's rather that there are actually very few people, and of those few people, you probably know pretty much all of them by name. That's like that's the important bit. There are the science that we celebrate from the early modern period in Europe, from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Is usually the exception even in Europe. And because we define Europe by the exceptional things that it did, that framework doesn't work with anywhere else. It doesn't even work with most of Europe. So if you want to say, German physics during the time of Newton, I mean, you won't find one much. You'll find like Leibniz, who is basically a secretary, right? That's, I mean, that's generally the case in most places. So in that sense, I would say the divergence isn't much of a divergence. It's not so much of a divergence as it's a matter of perspective. That's one thing I would say. And the Enlightenment, of course, brings, I would say, Europe even closer to the Ottoman Empire, because Enlightenment is a time of like public utility and things like that, which is quite common in the Ottoman Empire, anyways.
Okay, lovely. I mean, I promise that we are not going to be using technical terms, but I couldn't help but to conjure up the term teleology. I mean, this European exceptionalism is a kind of like reading the European past from the present perspective, and then that's how we ended up having a bunch of like selective great peoples in today's framework. So I am going to ask like two maybe more bit difficult questions, so to speak, and then I will go to our more magazine popular questions after that. The big question is, one of the big questions is about, again, Ottoman science, but I think this is also true in all other fields that we scholars are struggling to understand, is the difference between even divergence between theory and practice. That we know that technique was there, technology was there, practice was there, right? Not only in science and science technology, but also in governance. I don't know, in managing diversity, in dealing with non-Muslims, etc., etc.
Right.
So it's an empire which lasted close to 4 or 5 centuries, depending on where you were. Which means that there was a kind of success story there. But the reason of that success was somehow were not recorded, were not written down, and were not like passed down to next generations. Meaning there is almost no rhetoric, no theoretical contemplative work on the things that they had done. So this is more true in science, I guess. I mean, if you look at, again, history from your standpoint, from the standpoint of science and scientific history, why you think that we do not have much written, recorded, documented story of how did they do things, including engineering and military endeavors, and then medical endeavors. I know that this is just a difficult question that we are all struggling, but I want to hear your take on the issue.
Sure. Well, I mean, thank you. This is a difficult question. I mean, my view is that basically, if you're writing about something, it's likely that you aren't doing that which you're writing about. Not at that moment anyway. So writing about, say, like a certain practice usually comes, it may be like, you write about it after you retire, or like, once you have seen like 10,000 patients, you start thinking about, well, what does it all mean, or something like that. Or, and this is, I would say, the important thing about education, or, you just institutionalize it. You say, okay, I'm going to like assign somebody simply to like think and write about these things without really practicing it. And that's what, universities are, and that's what the medrese, for most part was. Right? I mean, in Europe, most university physicians actually didn't see patients. They just lectured. They read some books and they delivered some lectures. And that's a very special kind of thing that you don't really find in most places around the globe. And that's, again, a very Greek thing to do. Namely, to assign people who simply like teach things without necessarily being useful in other ways.
Right.
So, my understanding is that you basically, if you want to see the theory of something, and this is always a difficulty, like when you step outside of the university-educated Europe, you're never sure whether what you encounter is a theory. Whereas, in the European context, because of that Greek heritage that was, taught in schools, I mean, you have the idea that, you should treat something systematically, that you should probably, have an argument and present some proofs, etc., etc. Like, these are all things that get handed down from generation to generation through education. So my understanding is that, you have theory only if you are paying someone really well just to do theory, right? So you're basically taking someone out of the struggles of daily life, from requirements of utility, and then you're saying, okay, you know what? Your job is just to teach this stuff. And that takes a lot of faith, and that faith is very hard to cultivate even today in most places. I mean, I think it's simply a matter of luck that, some people who have money or power still maintain this faith, which makes, jobs like mine possible.
Right.
Because,
Right.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, it's, if you don't have me, no big deal. But if you don't have anyone like me, then it so happens that you don't have history of science, right? That's kind of like, the story with pretty much every discipline. And you can teach lots of things, at least, the parts that are useful through master-apprentice relationships. So, I mean, something like medicine, right? I mean, you can learn a lot of medicine simply by apprenticing under a practicing physician. What you won't learn are those things that are, usually considered like, the triage courses, or like the weed out courses, like organic chemistry or anatomy, where you need to like memorize a lot of stuff. Like that's what education does, right? It gives you like all of these things that you need to master without necessarily expecting any utility out of it. Whereas, if you apprentice, like, yeah, sure, like you can even like perform a lot of the surgeries just by observing a sufficient quantity of those surgeries. So, that's the thing. Like, I think in the Ottoman Empire, they just didn't really invest all that much money into just this useless educational aspect of it, which is, which makes them famously pragmatic. Which is, it's a thing, right? Ottoman pragmatism is a thing.
Right, absolutely. They were pragmatic and utilitarian in that regard. Would it be fair then to say, or to make a difference between, say, technique and technology and science, and then say that Ottomans were good at technique and technology, but not necessarily so in speculative sciences, especially natural sciences?
Right. So again, like this is one of the things that's very eye-opening in the history of science. So 50 years ago, if you ask people, a lot of them would tell you that we have technology because we have science, right? So science leads to technology. Today, most historians of science would tell you that no, it's actually the other way around. Like you get something like the technology first, and then people observe it, and then think about it, and then that leads to science. Right. I mean, the classic example is this thing that's called like mechanical philosophy. Again, very 17th century story. The idea that the world is somewhat like a machine, right? That's like a clockwork, or things like that. All of these things are called mechanical philosophy. But of course, you have lots of machines before you have something like mechanical philosophy, right? It follows practice by 200-300 years. So again, here I would say people, that the absence of theory doesn't keep people from practice. So in the Ottoman Empire, you have people who are practicing with pretty much, the same things that Europeans are practicing with. It's just that nobody's like, sitting around like with like hands in pocket and observing it and thinking about it and writing about it, right? So this like, this academic character, this idle character, he or she is the one that's missing from the picture in the Ottoman Empire. It's not really like a technical inferiority, and in a lot of ways. So like, medical drugs is like, a very big business in the early modern period. And my understanding is that, Istanbul is actually like a really good place to get drugs, because you can get pretty much everything. There is huge trade, huge volume, lots of different recipes to try out. So, this is like, again, no big problem. It's just that nobody is like taking a step back and thinking about, well, what does it mean that, I can get all of these like medicines in this city, right? So that's the thing that's missing. That doesn't mean that you can't get the medicine.
Right. That would actually take us to the lighter questions now, and then I would like to ask, and would that be the reason why, again, we did not have Newton or Marie Curie or Galileo in the Ottoman history? I mean, or is there anyone that you could tell us? I mean, who is your, for example, favorite scientists and their story, if you can tell?
I mean, there are lots. I would say so. Again, to just like to give you a sense of like how things worked in different periods. Maybe I can talk about a few people. So one person to think about is this character, Taqiyuddin, who is a rough contemporary of Tycho Brahe. So one lives from 1526 to 1585, the other one lives from 1546 to 1601. So what do these people have in common? They have in common an observatory, right? So 16th century, the Ottomans had an observatory. It didn't last a terrible long time, but here they have an observatory to basically, their numbers don't fit the observations anymore. So you have these things called ephemerides or star tables, and they are usually like, somebody like looks at the stars sometimes for like years, decades, even centuries on end, and they basically extrapolate from what they see how things are going to move in the coming years and centuries and millennia. And inevitably, because of the nature of the observation, nature of the calculation, these things go off. And so, the Ottomans had an observatory, arguably, because, these numbers were off, and Taqiyuddin wanted to, like, set these numbers straight. And then on the other hand, you have Tycho Brahe, and Tycho Brahe is also establishing an observatory, pretty much using, the same kinds of instruments with quite similar motivations, but, Tycho Brahe is also interested in the theory of the whole thing. But so you have these contemporary institutions, one in Uraniborg, which is like a little island, and not an insignificant detail is that Tycho Brahe is a lord, and Taqiyuddin is a salaried professor, right? So it's like there's that difference. But you have these two contemporaneous institutions that kind of give you a sense of parallelism, right? Same kind of astronomy, same kind of numerical concern, same kind of means of addressing these issues. So this is like one bit to keep in mind. And this is also my way of saying that if you think, for example, that the differences have to do with like cultural things, I doubt that's the reason, because this is as close as it gets. Again, if you just step back and look at the globe, these people, for anybody else living on the globe, these two people are doing pretty much the same thing, right? This is something to keep in mind. And then, again, if you look at the middle period, and I think this is also an illustrative example, is, and this is quite, of course, relevant, is the issue of smallpox vaccination. So we are like
interesting story, yes.
Yeah, we're like talking about vaccinations, etc. And there is this whole notion that smallpox inoculation came out of the Ottoman Empire, and it is quite quite true, because historically, yes, that's how things happened. So here there are two people to keep in mind. One of them is Emanuele Timoni, and he's living from 1669 to 1720. And then you have Lady Mary Montagu, who reports on smallpox inoculation, and she also kind of spearheads inoculation practice over in England during a smallpox outbreak. So what is Timoni writing about? Timoni is writing about a practice that was already established. So again, good thing to keep in mind. So Timoni is a professional trained physician who has a medical degree from the University of Padua. But what he's writing about when he's writing about smallpox inoculation is the practice that he observes. The fact that many people all over the Ottoman Empire practice this kind of like inoculation, and smallpox inoculation is basically you take a bit from like somebody infected. Smallpox gives you pustules, and then you get a bit of that, and then you put it on somebody else, and they get the disease, hopefully locally, and you basically make yourself slightly sick on purpose, which is not different from inoculation today, not terribly different at least. But so that's the idea. It's established practice. Like nobody had to write a book about this. In fact, people didn't write books about this, which is why we don't know the origins of the whole thing. We just know that these many practicing physicians did this all over the empire. And Emmanuel Timoni, who was like writing a report about this in the early 1710s, is basically telling you this. Like this is what it is. Most people do it. We have basically defeated smallpox. So this is like the big success story
Right.
for the Ottomans. That, as in like people don't seem to die from it anymore. And then Lady Montagu is basically telling British people the same thing, and of course physicians, the scholastic physicians, the university trained physicians are, well, they kind of are skeptical in England, partly because they haven't seen it in practice in the way that Timoni has. So they don't really want to apply this. It's only like during an outbreak that Lady Montagu decides to like inoculate herself and I think her children, and then she convinces some other people, and like in 10 years I think a total of like maybe like 100 people end up getting smallpox inoculation in England. And that's that's partly the story of the Enlightenment. It's really hard to get people to deliberately make themselves like mildly sick. People are just suspicious in many ways. Even the physicians, many of them are suspicious. But anyway, so it doesn't really take hold like immediately or anything. It takes maybe 30, 40, 50 years, right, before this inoculation practice takes hold. But again, this is like a good way to look at this practical period, like how things work. Like practice comes first. It's widespread. It seems to work at least, and then you have somebody who writes a book about it at the tail end, not at the beginning, and then the story moves from there, right? So this is like a good example of like how things work in the middle period. And then you have the late period, and this is like a character that I like quite a lot. This guy Hoca Tahsin, he's a professor at the Darülfünun, the new like university style institution that you find in Istanbul, and I like him for a number of reasons. So he is actually he's buried right here somewhere. I live in Erenköy. I've lived in Erenköy for a long time, and he's buried here. And he, I think his house was even here. Anyway, so this guy, he is from Ioannina, which is in Greece today, and he gets an education like an old school like medrese education, and then at some point he goes to France to get a university education. And then when he gets a university education there, he kind of like becomes like this different character, and there's this whole like self-fashioning involved in studying abroad, just as there is today, because you look like I'm like a Turkish guy, like I was born in Konya, and here I am like an American professor, right? It's like this whole like self-fashioning that happens with studying abroad. So you get it with Hoca Tahsin also. And then he comes back. He teaches physics and astronomy. He even writes books about physics and astronomy. He's got a personal lab in his house. And then he eventually becomes the president of Darülfünun. And I think he just is like, starts talking a little too boldly, and then he gets sacked, and then he just starts living at home and teaching it at smaller schools, and then doing his experiments, writing his books, whatever. So that's the 19th century story, where like you have a very distinct kind of westernization that's happening, that's attached to the new efflorescence, I would say, of the European university, because the 18th century is a terrible time for European universities, and I would say probably the university field in Europe doesn't really recover pretty much until the time that you have something like Darülfünun. Mid 19th century is about the time when universities in Europe really start to recover, and voila, you know, within like a couple of decades, you have an Ottoman version of the university. So that's the 19th century, the westernization, the tail end of the story that I would kind of like to highlight.
Awesome. Harun, I mean, I would love to continue this fascinating story with you another hour, but we have a limited time.
Sure.
Time is like, you know, coming to an end. But before that, I would like to acknowledge some questions, you know, written in our QA box. There's, unfortunately, they are all great questions, but as you might understand, we cannot answer them all at once. I just would like to go with some of them by naming the question askers at the same time. Abby Knappenberger asking the connection between astrology and Islamic mysticism. Harun, if you don't mind, let me just give short summaries of these questions and then you answer in your own pace, because we have probably another 5 minutes to go. I don't want to go over time much. The connection between, again, mysticism and astrology is there. Another follower of us asking, Sayyid Mustafa Ali is asking the connection between colonialism and, of course, European science, which is obviously there. And our another follower, Atajan Atakan, is asking the acknowledgement of Islamic sciences or civilization in Ottoman science. These are all big questions, I know, but you just entertain as much as you want. And finally, Naomi Gartner is asking about printing press and its impact on the dissemination of knowledge in the Ottoman Empire. Again, I know that you don't have much time. You have a few minutes to go. Say a few things about those questions by way of also appreciating and thanking to our listeners.
Sure. First about, astrology, mysticism connection. There may or may not be that connection depending on who is doing the astrology. So there is, a very matter of fact, very straightforward way of doing astrology that doesn't really involve anything mystical at all. Just, straight up, if you have a conjunction of Jupiter with Venus, this is what you get. And that doesn't take much mysticism. There are people who are interested in this more mystically, so who attach mystical properties the sun, the moon, the planets, so on and so forth. There is that, but I would say it's not everybody. There is, you can have astrology. The Ottomans did have astrology that had no mystical references. And then the colonialism question. That's a very good question. This is one thing that I think distinguishes Europe, not because it's Europe, but because it's a thing. And colonialism is part of it. So I would say there is maybe a greater set that includes colonialism. Europeans are very good at accumulating stuff. They aren't always just, fighting to get this stuff. Sometimes they just buy this stuff. As a consequence of which, the rare and fine things from pretty much everywhere on the planet ends up in European museums and libraries. Whereas, fine and rare things from Europe don't end up in anywhere pretty much around the globe. So, there are some very good Turkish manuscripts in Europe right now, or, generally in the West. Not because, the Ottomans were colonized, but because, somebody in Europe decided, oh, you know what, I'm going to pay money for these things and I'm going to collect as much of these things as I can. So as a consequence, you have almost no early modern European books in Istanbul. None that remain anyways, whereas you have lots of early modern Ottoman books in Europe, which remain, which are curated, deposited in libraries, etc., etc. Now, colonialism's erasure, that's also an interesting question because, European colonial arrangements aren't the only colonial arrangements there are. Look, the Ottoman Empire, the question is, well, is it an empire? And if it is an empire, like, you know, what kind of erasure can we talk about in the Ottoman case, right? Is it similar to what you find in, like, you know, Europe's erasure of the other? Because, you know, Ottomans had others. And, right, so there is like a question there. But I would say, you know, the colonialism in the European context is a question that's part of like this bigger question of like, why Europeans decided to accumulate this much stuff at some point in history. Because they didn't accumulate stuff like since time immemorial. Like they definitely start accumulating stuff at some point in history. And colonialism helps this process immensely, of course. If you can get like free things by coercion, or if you can like enslave people to create surplus, yes, that helps you accumulate things. But the thing is, why do you have this drive to accumulate books, for example, when most people elsewhere don't seem to have this drive? So that's, I would say, that's the question I have here.
Printing press, and then the other one was like acknowledgement of Islamic civilization and sciences in the
printing press.
times.
So printing press is interesting. So as a technology, you find it in Istanbul almost as soon as you find it in Europe. As far as I know, like, you know, the Jewish printing press in Istanbul.
Yeah, 1496.
Actually. Yeah, like really early, like, you know, just right there. You know, technology is definitely not missing in Istanbul. Books somehow don't get printed. I mean, so there are like, you know, very many different reasons, period specific reasons for why that might be the case. But here's what I would say. When the first supposed like printing press, Muslim printing press gets established in Istanbul, people don't seem to like buy books. Like it's not a good business. So I don't know where that leaves us. What is very important, I would say, and maybe like even today, that's something to keep in mind. I would say the main thing that makes a difference for like general learning in Istanbul and in the Ottoman Empire is public libraries. Right? It's not the printing press. It's not the ability to like buy and own books. It's rather, you know, having these libraries that house a good number of books where you can also socialize yourself into a world of learning. I would say those probably are much more important than the printing press ever was. And fun fact, the machine that's used for printing in this period, in the 17th century and definitely in the 15th century, is almost identical to the machine that you use to mint coins at around the same time. Just like the mechanism is pretty much the same thing. And, you know, of course, like machines don't have a tremendous amount of variety until fairly late in history, which is, you know, this is not surprising, but, you know, it's just something to keep in mind. So, you know, it's a complicated question.
Absolutely.
So recognition of Islamic civilization. I mean, see, golden age of the empire. I mean, Islam is important up to a certain point. I mean, again, like, you know, when you have like robust madrasas where like everybody's like a, you know, like basically a member of what we have come to call the Islamic civilization by profession, right? Then you have, you know, it matters a lot more. And then at some point, I don't think it really matters all that much anymore. I mean, yeah, because it's so useful, like, you know, utilitarian. Does like, you know, do phones have religions, or like, you know, do you feel any religious feelings when you go get aspirin? I mean, I think that's kind of like how the Ottomans approached the material once this practical turn was in effect. And I mean, you have some people who still think, well, you know, well, what about like, you know, all this Islamic stuff? But those people, I would say, are quite rare in comparison to like all these people who are just pragmatically doing, you know, manipulative things with nature, right? Who are like, you know, building buildings and administering drugs and shooting cannons, so on and so forth. Like, I don't think they really think about the civilization aspect all that much.
Yeah, it is again like much safer to say that. I mean, there could be some people, but not all of them were the same. I mean, it's better to make that differentiation. Okay, by saying that, it would be a great segue to close of our today's discussion, fascinating discussion. Thanks to Harun, Dr. Harun Küçük, and also I would like to thank to all the listeners who have been with us so far and attentively following our discussion. I owe Harun for another reason that he is the inspiration behind the naming of this talk series. I mean, he was the one who suggested Humans of Ottoman Empire to me, and the name was stuck, and I should thank him for that. And also, we would like to thank to Yunus Emre Institute one more time, which is a cultural institution aiming to disseminate or teach about Turkish history and culture through various activities. And this is just part of that endeavor, and I would like to thank to them for that reason as well. And that would be it for today. I would love to say have a good day until the next event, which is going to happen next week. Stay well and be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.